Everybody, we are going to do Habakkuk chapter 3 today. I hope you're ready for that. Habakkuk chapter 3. How have you been liking Habakkuk? Today's our last message from Habakkuk. My hope and prayer is that as you open up to Habakkuk, you have an idea and a sense of what Habakkuk is all about from now on. Chapter 3 is a wonderful chapter. It's often thought of as one of the best psalms in all of the Bible. And I know we think about the Psalms, we think about the book of Psalms. But Habakkuk chapter 3 is also a psalm in its own right. And it's often regarded as one of the most beautiful psalms in all of the Bible. So we're going to go through that today, and we're going to see what the prophet Habakkuk has to say to us as he concludes his message for us today. There was a hospital where a patient knocked over a cup of water, which spilled onto the floor beside the patient's bed. The patient was afraid he might slip on the water if he got out of the bed, so he asked a nurse's aide to mop it up. The patient didn't know it, but the hospital policy said that small spills were the responsibility of the nurse's aides, while large spills were to be mopped up by the hospital's housekeeping group. The nurse's aide decided that the spill was a large one, so she called the housekeeping department. A housekeeper arrived and declared the spill a small one, and an argument ensued. You ever heard anything like this, Sherry? Maybe. It's not my responsibility, said the nurse's aide, because it's a large puddle. The housekeeper did not agree. Well, it's not mine. The puddle is too small. The exasperated patient listened on for a time, then took a pitcher of water from his night table and poured the whole thing on the floor. Is that enough of a puddle now for you two to figure this out? He asked, and it was, and that was the end of the argument. You know, sometimes we just need results. We just need things to happen. We just need to move on with life. It's time to stop bickering. It's time to stop fighting. And it's just time to move on. We've got to get to the end of what we're doing. What do you suppose the result of Habakkuk learning all about this, all about the Babylonians? God had spent the first 2 chapters. We've learned about the Babylonians. Last week we looked at the 5 woes of Babylon, from great to gone. And what did God think of the Babylonians? And what did people think of the Babylonians? And how do you think Habakkuk felt as he knew that this impending army of the Babylonians was going to approach Judah, was going to knock them out, was going to take out Jerusalem? His livelihood was going to be gone. Many people were going to die. God's judgment of the Babylonians was coming. And this was a ruthless people. What do you think he felt? What do you think the result of this all was? Do you think Habakkuk is going to be depressed? Do you ever get news sometimes that just makes you want to retreat into your bedroom and just kind of hide away and just hope it goes away and nobody finds you out and you just kind of want to go away? When you get really bad news like this, maybe you just get depressed. Maybe that's how Habakkuk felt. Will he get mad at God? Have you ever had somebody say, God, why me? And they shake their fist. Why me, God? Why would you let me have to deal with the Babylonians? It's these other people in Judah that are bad. Why do I have to get in on any of this? And he gets mad at God. You ever have anybody, maybe that's happened to you, why you get mad at God. Something happened to you that you didn't like, and it's all God's fault. Do you think that's what happened to Habakkuk? Will he question God? Will he say, why me? Will he say, can't you do something else? Will he want revenge? Will he get so mad at the Babylonians that he decides to get revenge on the Babylonians? Maybe get revenge on God? Maybe he'll turn away from God entirely. Maybe you've had something happen in your life and you just decide, you know what? I'm done with church. I'm done with God. I'm done with all this. If this is how you're going to handle me, if this is how you're going to treat me, if this is how you're going to treat my people, I'm out. Maybe you've known somebody like that. Maybe that's been you before in life. You just walk away. Maybe he's going to turn to drugs and alcohol. Sometimes when life gets really hard and things start to get really difficult for us as people, sometimes we turn to drugs and alcohol. Do you know anybody that's turned to drugs or alcohol? I do. It's rough. What happens when life gets tough? What happens when you know things are going to happen that you don't want to have happen? When life is outside of your control, what happens? What do you think Habakkuk is going to do? If you've read chapter 3, you know what Habakkuk is going to do, and he doesn't do any of these things. There's an old saying that goes something like this: a calm sea does not produce a skilled sailor. Sometimes some of the best teachers in life are the hardest ones. When I was in college, my favorite professor, looking back, wasn't the easy elementary teacher. My favorite professor in college was the one who had two of the toughest classes on the undergraduate level. I took both of those classes in the same term. I was tough, but a calm sea does not produce a skilled sailor. Sometimes you got to go through stuff to get good at things, to get good at life. You got to take your bruises, you got to take your bumps, and you get better and you grow up. You mature. And this is what happened to Habakkuk. He knew that he was looking down the line of the barrel. And this was going to happen, and it was going to be tough, and it's going to hurt, and it's going to be rough. But he didn't waver, and he didn't flinch. He didn't run. He didn't get depressed. He didn't turn aside. He stayed true to God no matter what's going to happen. Because as we read before in chapter 2, the just shall live by faith. And if this is what God says needs to happen, then that's okay. Are you okay with the things that God says need to happen in this life? Is things okay for you? So today in chapter 3, God wants you to see how Habakkuk responds to God. How does Habakkuk respond to God? After understanding these woes of Babylon, after asking his questions in the first couple of chapters, how does Habakkuk respond to God? There's 3 ways that he responds. Verses 1 and 2, we see Habakkuk's truth about God. He's going to reveal to us what he believes is true about God. Number 2, verses 3 through 15, Habakkuk's testimony of God. What does he think about God? And then in verses 16 through 19, Habakkuk's trust in God. I'm calling this section from worry to worship. So oftentimes in our life, there are things that happen that get us down, that make us worried, concerned. We're interested. We're kind of wondering what's going to happen. And I want us to be the kind of people who, like Habakkuk, can go from worry to worship. Where we go from this wondering what's going to happen to complete trust in God and being okay with whatever happens in this life because we believe that God has everything under control. So let's start to look at this. Verses 1 and 2, Habakkuk's truth about God. A prayer of Habakkuk, the prophet, on Shigionoth. O Lord, I have heard your speech and was afraid. O Lord, revive your work in the midst of the years. In the midst of the years, make it known. In wrath, remember mercy. So here's his truth about God. That God is going to be able to do something wonderful, even though something terrible is going to happen. The country of Judah is going to be annihilated and just destroyed. Captives are going to be taken, and it's going to be conquered. That doesn't sound like great news. If you knew that this week the United States of America is going to be conquered by a foreign nation, I don't know if that would be the best news I could hear this week. But can you imagine the prophet Habakkuk got that news? Judah is going to be destroyed. Babylon is coming. And he says, that's okay. God is in control. I trust God more than I trust Judah or the kings of Judah. I trust God more than I trust Babylon or the king of Babylon. God, you're in control, and it's going to be okay. I trust you, Lord. I've heard your speech and was afraid. Can you imagine somebody who's so full of faith as Habakkuk was, and yet he was still afraid? Can there be fear in faith? Yes. That may fly in the face of some of us. If you are truly, having faith in God and just trust in Him, you shouldn't be afraid of anything. Well, I don't know, Habakkuk was. With his lips quivering. You ever told somebody some bad news and their lips start to quiver? They're so afraid of what's going to happen. Their lips are just quivering, and you can just see the prophet Habakkuk. His lips are quivering. He's afraid. He doesn't want these Babylons to come in. This has got to be some terrible news for him. His lips are quivering. He's afraid of what's going to happen. And yet, in the midst of the fear that he has of the incoming Babylonians, it's going to be okay. O Lord, revive your work in the midst of the years. What is the work that he's talking about? The work that he's doing with Israel, with Judah, the Jews as a whole. He has a plan for these people, all the way back to Abraham. All nations of the earth are going to be blessed by you, he tells Abraham. Habakkuk knows that God's not going to wipe the Jews off the face of the planet. That's not what's going to happen. There's going to be a bump in the road here. There's going to be some going to exile. But as we know, as we've read Nehemiah, the people do come back to the land. And what Habakkuk is saying here, that Lord, in coming years, there's going to be a hope for Israel yet. And it's okay. His truth about God is this: I'm going to trust him. In the midst of the years, make it known, and in wrath, remember mercy. God is throwing out his wrath on these people as a result of their sin, as a result of their waywardness, as a result of not keeping covenant, as a result of throwing away everything they knew about God and just living life in their own way. God is going to be judging this nation, these people. And Habakkuk says, in wrath, remember mercy. And he does, because he does allow that remnant to return later on, as we've read in Nehemiah and in Ezra. And then in verses 3 through 15, Habakkuk's testimony of God. So as we go through these next several verses here, we're going to be told a little story by Habakkuk. He's going to give us a little history of Israel. So as he's pondering, as he's considering the works of God's hands, as he's trying to think about how can I trust God, one of the best ways that we can develop our trust in God is to think about in the past, how has God been faithful before? Can you think of a time in your life when God was faithful to you? Has there been a time in your life when you've prayed, Lord, I'm going to need this, Lord, I'm going to need that, or something's going to happen, and Lord, help me with this, and he answered you, and he helped you, and he was there for you? There was a time in my life, I remember when I had pneumonia. Maybe I've told you this story before. Don't stop me if you have, because this is a great story. It's one of my favorite stories of my Christian life and how God has worked in my life. As I try to think in my life, can I trust God today? As I think about how did I trust God yesterday, in yesteryears, when I had pneumonia, this was probably, gosh, how many years ago was this, Dad? And this is probably more than 15 years ago. Yeah, this summer or this winter. It was between semesters. I was at school. And I came home and I didn't know, I thought I was going to die. I ended up in the hospital for 3 days with pneumonia. And I somehow magically, miraculously survived. It was amazing. The doctor said that one more day without medical intervention, I probably would have died from kidney failure. But God, okay, I'm still here, so that's great. But you know what happens when you go to the hospital for a little bit? What do you get in the mail after a little while? A bill. Oh boy, heaven have mercy. And a big one too. You don't just have pneumonia for 3 days in the hospital and just walk away scot-free. Let me tell you something. I didn't have insurance. This was many years ago. I cannot begin to tell you guys how many times a day I prayed, Lord, I need some help. I went in and talked to the charity care program at the hospital, and I filled out the paperwork, and I said, Lord, please, if you love me at all. I prayed day after day for weeks. And I tell you what, I still remember the morning checking my mail, sitting down for breakfast at campus, opening up the letter from the hospital, and it said, your bill has been paid for 100% by the charity care program. Still makes me feel verklempt to this day, thinking about God was there for me yesterday. In yesteryear, I could trust him for things that are happening in my life. And since I could trust him for things that are happening in my life, can I trust him for things that are happening in my life today? No matter what befalls me today, no matter what happens, no matter who gets in my way, no matter what happens in life, can I trust God today as a result of being able to trust Him in yesteryear? Absolutely yes. And Habakkuk here remembers and recalls ways that the people of Judah, the nation of Israel, how have they been able to depend upon God? When were they able to trust Him? And since they were able to trust Him in these ways, Habakkuk knows that he can trust Him for what's going to happen. So as this breaks down into 5 different parts here, verses 3 and 4, is he's reminiscing about Sinai. Remember Sinai when Moses was at Sinai? He says, God came from Teman, the Holy One from Mount Paran, Selah. His glory covered the heaven, and the earth was full of His praise. His brightness was like the light, and He had rays flashing from His hand, and there were power, and His power was hidden. Before Him was pestilence, and he goes on through verse 5. But verses 3 and 4 was at Sinai, when Moses was on the mountain, and God is giving the 10 Commandments. We're going to go all the way back to that beginning. Was God faithful to the people at that time? All God's people said, Amen. Yes, He was. He was faithful. The people might not have been faithful at that time, even though they're like, yeah, we're going to do this. Absolutely. Moses no sooner gets back down from the mountain than they've already got a golden calf built. And Moses is like, ugh. But God was faithful. Even if the people weren't, God was faithful. Verse 5, the plagues in the desert. Remember after Sinai, they were going to go into the land of Canaan. They sent out the spies. You remember that? And 2 of them come back, Joshua and Caleb, and say, yeah, we can do this. And the other 10 are like, no, I don't think so. And God judges them in the desert. We have plagues in the desert in verse 5. Before Him went pestilence, and fever followed at His feet. So they were in the desert, wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. Was God faithful to them in those 40 years, or did God just kind of leave them hanging? He was faithful. They had manna to eat every single day. Their clothes never wore out. Can you imagine that for 40 years? I would love to have these shoes for 40 years. They did. Wandering in the desert, God was faithful. So God was faithful with Moses on Mount Sinai. God was faithful in the desert. And then in verses 6 through 10, you remember after they get out of the desert, that generation all dead, Joshua's now the leader. And we studied Joshua. And that was a fun study, I think anyway. They're going to enter into the land of Canaan, verses 6 through 10. He stood and measured the earth. He looked and startled the nation. And the everlasting mountains were scattered. The perpetual hills bowed. His ways are everlasting. I saw the tents of Cushan in affliction. The curtains of the land of Midian trembled. O Lord, you were displeased with the rivers. Was your anger against the rivers? Was your wrath against the sea? That you rode on your horses, your chariots of salvation. Your bow was made quite ready. Oaths were sworn over your arrows. You divided the earth with rivers. The mountains you saw and trembled. The overflowing of the water passed by. The deep uttered its voice and lifted its hands on high. So they conquer the land of Canaan. They go in there. And God allows them to have victory after victory after victory. No matter what's going on, when they were faithful to Him, God was faithful to them. And it was an amazing thing as we studied Joshua, how they were able to take Jericho just like that. They didn't have to shoot one arrow, did they? Victory after victory. And when they were not faithful to God, God punished them. But God was always faithful to them. Even in the midst of punishment, God was always faithful to them. And then in verse 11, you remember this story? The sun and the moon stood still in their habitation. At the light of your arrows they went, at the shining of your glittering spear. Do you remember that story in Joshua when the sun stood still? Joshua's fighting, and he needs more time, and he prays to the Lord for more time. And the sun stands still. Do you remember that story? Was God faithful to them? He sure was. Absolutely he was. And then in verses 12 through 15, there's victories accomplished by God and for his people. Now, these ones maybe not, I mean, you're probably thinking to yourself, where are you getting some of these? But that's what he's talking about. But these rest of the ones from verses 12 and 15, some of these ones are a little bit more, I don't know, generic in nature or in scope. But he says this, you marched through the land in indignation. You trampled the nations in anger. You went forth for the salvation of your people, for salvation with your anointed. You struck the head from the house of the wicked by laying bare from foundation to neck. You thrust through with his own arrows the head of his villages. They came out like a whirlwind to scatter me. Their rejoicing was like feasting on the poor in secret. You walked through the sea with your horses through the heap of great waters. So this is more of a generic, he's just kind of reminiscing. You ever just think about things and you're kind of like paraphrasing like events that have happened in your life? And you're maybe not necessarily reflecting on any one memory or event. You're just kind of reminiscing on how things have happened in your life. And Habakkuk is just kind of concluding this thought of his testimony of God with just these generic ideas and feelings about how we definitely can have faith in God in his faithfulness to us. He's not going to leave us. He's not going to leave us hanging. He's not going to forsake us. He's not going to leave us hanging or anything like that. Habakkuk's testimony of God is how he responds to God. Before he goes and shudders away, before he goes and hides, before he gets depressed, before he runs away, before he turns to anyone or anything else, and before he gives up on God entirely, he thinks and reminisces to himself on all the ways that God has shown himself faithful to the nation of Israel. And he remembers and realizes that because God has been faithful in the past, God will be faithful in the future. And even though the future doesn't look very bright in the short term for Habakkuk and his people, God will be faithful in the long run. And what he's going to go through is going to hurt. And that's why he's afraid. But his faith is strong in God. The testimony of the Lord speaks for itself. There's no reason for any one of us to ever turn aside from the Lord. There's no reason for any one of us to ever give up on God or think that God has forsaken us or wonder if God has left us or wonder why does God not love me like he loves other people? Why does he not bless me like he blesses other people? Sometimes we question things like this, and we need to not do that. We've got to recognize that God is faithful. He's the same every single day. He doesn't change. He's not going to give up on us, and that there's nothing that can separate us from the love of God which is in Christ Jesus. This testimony of God from Habakkuk is very powerful as we think about that in our own lives. And I hope you can come up with a way in your life when you can think about how has God been faithful to you. And then finally, as we think about Habakkuk responding to God, verses 16 through 19, Habakkuk's trust in God. He says, when I heard, my body trembled. My lips quivered at the voice. Rottenness entered my bones, and I trembled in myself, that I might rest in the day of trouble. When he comes up to the people, he will invade them with his troops. Boy, what's he talking about there? The incoming invasion of the Babylonians. Guys, he's scared to death. None of us have really had to face something like that. Habakkuk did, and his body trembled, his lips quivered, rottenness entered into his bones. You ever have something that stresses you out so much that you just feel sick? Habakkuk did. And I suspect we've all faced things like that, where we've just gone through something that just made us feel sick and weary and not well. I trembled in myself that I might rest in the day of trouble. When he comes up to the people and he will invade them with his troops. Babylon is coming. Don't doubt that. Though the fig tree may not blossom, nor fruit be on the vine, though the labor of the olive tree may fail, and the fields yield no food, though the flock may be cut off from the fold, and there will be no herd in the stalls. He's saying some really negative things here. Because when the Babylonians come in, they're not going to leave anything standing. They're taking everything out. They're taking everything with them. In fact, when Nebuchadnezzar enters into the temple, he takes away not just a couple pieces of cutlery of gold from the temple. He takes it all. He takes everything. In fact, it lasts for years and years. And we saw in Daniel chapter 5, when that big feast happens, they bring out all the ornate gold from the temple that Nebuchadnezzar took all those years ago. They trash the place. They cut everything down. They kill as many people as they can. They set fire to homes, and they ravage that land. Habakkuk knows it's coming. And he says, even though all these things are going to be gone, the fig tree is not going to blossom. There's not going to be any more fruit on the vines. Remember, agriculture, fruit, like figs, olives, grapes, all important industry to Israel. None of that stuff's going to grow. The labor of the olive tree may fail. The fields yield no food. Nothing's happening. And though the flock may be cut off from the fold, no herd in the stalls. When everything looks bleak, when everything looks like it's bad, when it doesn't look like there's any hope for recovery, how does Habakkuk respond to God in the midst of all of these things? Verse 18, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. Wow. When life hits you and hits you hard, do your shoulders square up and you say, you know what? No matter what happens to me, no matter what happens to my family, I will trust in the Lord. Or are you a duck and run kind of guy? Are you a turn and burn? What describes you in your life? If we think that life is all sunshine and rainbows and everything's just always going to go our way and we're never going to have any real problems, and that would be great, wouldn't it? But that's not how life works. That's not how life has ever worked. There are things that happen to people, and life hits, and it hits really, really hard. And Habakkuk says that when life hits me about as hard as life will ever hit me, I'm going to square up my shoulders. I'm going to place my head up high. Even if my lips are quivering, I will trust in the Lord. And as we go through Habakkuk, I hope that you remember that this is how a real man, a real prophet of God, stands before his God in the midst of suffering, in the midst of hard times, in the midst of hardship. This is how a man of God stands. And I hope this is how you stand when you go through life. This is one of the reasons I wanted to do Habakkuk after doing 1 Peter. We studied 1 Peter and we saw all about what happens in these provisions for suffering, and how do you handle it when life gets tough, and how do you handle it when life doesn't go your way. And here we see somebody whose life is not going his way. I suspect this is not how Habakkuk wanted his life to go. And when it doesn't go his way and he feels out of control and he feels like he's not getting what he wants, and the invasion of the Babylonians is imminent, he doesn't get mad. He doesn't start screaming at God. He doesn't stop going to church because he gets all mad about it. He says, yet I will trust and rejoice in the Lord. I will joy in the God of my salvation. He recognizes that his salvation that he needs from God doesn't come from anywhere else. The Lord God is my strength. He doesn't find his strength in someone or something else. Sometimes when we go through these hard times in life, we like to affix ourselves to something else or someone else, hoping that that thing or that person will be what gets us through the tough time. A lot of people turn to drugs and alcohol as they go through tough times, and they hope that by drowning out their sorrows, they'll be able to get through. If they could just have one more shot of this or one more hit of that, and they could just get through times, and they would get through the hard time. Or they can't handle what's going on at home, and so they got to go out to the bar and have drinks with the boys because this is what they need to do to get through. They're trying to find their strength in somewhere else other than God. And we need to be the kind of person like Habakkuk who rejoices in the Lord in the midst of these hard times. When we find our strength in the Lord, in the midst of these hard times. He will make my feet like the deer's feet, and he will make me walk on my high hills. Have you ever seen like these like goats and stuff like climbing on the side of a mountain? And you wonder what in the world, like what kind of anti-gravity device does this goat have that keeps this animal from falling straight off of that thing? I wouldn't get 10 feet off the ground and I'd be falling off. And this deer just kind of jumps around like he's got hover boots or something. And Habakkuk is saying, I will be able to get through my life with such skill, just like these goats and these other animals that can climb the side of a mountain and it looks like they got hover boots on. I will be able to get through my life with the exact same kind of skill because I find my strength in the Lord, no matter what's going on. You know, this invasion of the Babylonians really struck a chord with the nation of Judah. And after they have been exiled, they return back home, as we've read in Nehemiah and in Ezra. They come back home. And for 400 more years, until the time of Jesus, they begin to develop and separate themselves by the law, because they're so afraid of not keeping covenant anymore. Because this is why God rained it down on them, because they failed to keep covenant. They weren't keeping the 10 Commandments. They had forsaken what God had asked them to do. So they decide, all right, we don't want this to happen to us again, so what do we need to do? We need to get ourselves to the point where we're so understanding of what the law of God says that we'll never break it again. And for 400 years, they work on this. And as we study Mark next, we're going to bump into this group of people that have so separated themselves and been so working on this that Jesus himself is the one that's going to have to deal with this group of people. Do you know what this group of people is called? The Pharisees. Did you guys know that? The Israelites so didn't want this to happen to them again. They separated themselves out to follow the law so specifically that they'd never break it again. And that's why as Jesus bumps into these people and he says to them, you know, you got to keep the law. And they always say, what do they say? I did. They're so convinced that they're not breaking the law anymore that nothing bad will happen to them again, because they've got it all figured out. And as we go through Mark, we're going to see how Jesus handles these people then. How does he respond and react to a group of people that act like this? Because they're so afraid of being sent into exile again as a result of breaking the laws of God. And I hope that as we've concluded Habakkuk, you've learned a little something about yourself. You've learned a little something about Habakkuk. You've learned how to handle when life gets hard as we've studied 1 Peter and Habakkuk. Let's pray.